Hello, my name is Brant Hunt. Today is the 18th day of May, 2022. My channel on YouTube is Discerning What is True, and I'm doing the last installment of Natural Law by Lysander. This is chapter 3. So we'll begin to read here. Well, I hope all is well today. I hope everybody's doing well. A little warm here today, but that's to be expected here in the South. Okay, chapter 3, natural law contrasts with legislation. So what I want to say one thing real quick here is that natural law should be actually the foundation of all things. I'm a very big proponent of basically simply is we don't need any political leaders because most of them are lawyers who actually create criminals. They basically get us in trouble when in reality they are the real criminals, you see. I hopefully in the near future I'll do the book by a gentleman here, Law Unto Lawyers. I got that out of the library, what I call interlibrary loan. Most people are not aware of interlibrary loan. You can actually ask the library that you're located at, a county library, and simply say, I'd like to check out this book, and I know you don't have it here, but I'd like to get it in a library loan. And as long as you're, a member of the library, you should be able to get this free. And usually you have, most of the time, 4 weeks to read that book. So this is just like to let you know simply, you can check out books that are not actually, and you need to be doing this. You need to be educating. You need to be educating yourself. Okay, that's just the key here. So here we go. So we're talking about, again, like I said, natural law contrasts with legislation. Okay, and I'll say one more thing. Life would be a lot easier or more pleasant in this realm if we didn't have lawyers. Okay, so here we go. Natural law, natural justice being a principle that is naturally applicable and adequate to the rightful settlement of every possible controversy that can arise among men, being to the only standard by which any controversy whatever between man and man can be rightfully settled, being a principle whose protection every man demands for himself, whether he is willing to accord it to others or not, being also immutable principle, one that is always and everywhere the same in all ages and nations, being self-evidently necessary in all times and places, being so entirely impartial and equitable towards all, so indispensable to the peace of mankind everywhere, so vital to the safety and welfare of every human being. 2, so easily learned, so gently known, and so easily maintained by such voluntary associations as all honest men can readily and rightfully form for that purpose. Being such a principle as this, these questions arise. Why is it that it does not universally or well nigh universally prevail? Why is it that it has not ages ago been established throughout the world as the one only law that any man or any men could rightfully be compelled to obey? Why is it that any human being ever conceived that anything so self-evidently, superfluously false, absurd, and atrocious that all legislation necessary must be, could be of any use to mankind, or have any place in human affairs? Yeah, it's all bunk. They create laws that actually are not natural laws. And the testimony of that simply is go to your library or go to where your state capitol is and look around and see all the books that are there of their codes and laws. And reality simply is that they are not even close to being what we call natural law. These people have set themselves up as though they are the rulers of all things. And the sad part is simply is that most people are just giving their authority away. So section 2 here is the answer is that through all historical times, wherever any people have advanced beyond the savage state and have learned to increase their means of subsistence by the cultivation of the soil, a greater or less number of them have associated and organized themselves as robbers to plunder and enslave all others who have either accumulated any property that could be seized or have shown by their labor that they could be made to contribute to the support or pleasure of those who should enslave them. You know what they're talking about here? He's not talking about what we call a physical slave. I mean, a physical thieves. These are the people who are in office. In my opinion, that's just how I see it. Usually, you can probably get along with most of your neighbors, not all, but it's the ones up there in high places that are the ones who actually steal from you. And that's what I said. They are the true criminals, you see. These hands of robbers, small in number at first, have increased their power by uniting with each other. Now, this is what he's talking about, simply different what I'm saying. Inventing warlike weapons, although this probably started out with what we call tribes, possibility, disciplining themselves and perfecting their organization as military forces and dividing their plunder, including their captives, among themselves, either in such proportions as have been previously agreed on or in such as their leaders, always desirous to increase the number of their followers, should prescribe. The success of these band of robbers was an easy thing for the reason that those whom they plunder and enslave were comparatively defenseless, being scattered thinly over the country, engaged wholly in trying to, by rude implements and heavy labor, to extort a subsistence from the soil, having no weapons of war other than sticks and stones, having no military discipline or organization, and no means of concentrating their forces or acting in concert. When suddenly attacked under these circumstances, the only alternate left them for saving even their lives or the lives of their family was to yield up not only their crops they had gathered in the lands that they have cultivated, but themselves and their family also as slaves. Therefore, their fate was as slaves to cultivate for others the lands they had before cultivated for themselves, being driven constantly to their labor. Wealth slowly increased, but all went into the hands of their tyrants. These tyrants lived solely on plunder and on the labor of their slaves, and applying all their energies to the seizure of still more plunder and the enslavement of still other defenseless persons, increasing to their numbers. Perfecting their organization and multiplying their weapons of war, they extend their conquests until, in order to hold what they had already got, it became necessary for them to act systematically and co-op with each other in holding their slaves in subjection. But all this they can do only by establishing what they call a government and making what they call laws. All the great governments of the world, those now existing as well as those that have passed away, have been of this character. They have been mere bands of robbers who have associated for purpose of plunder, conquest, and the enslavement of their fellow man. And their laws, as they have called them, have been only such agreements as they have found it necessary to enter into in order to maintain their organization and to act together in plundering and enslaving others, and in securing to each his agreed share of the spoils. All these laws have had no more real obligation than have the agreements which brigands, bandits, and pirates find it necessary to enter into with each other for the more successful accomplishments of their crimes and the more peaceable division of their spoils. Thus, substantially all the legislation of the world has had its origins in the desire of one class of persons to plunder and enslave others and hold them as property. Section 3. In process of time, the robber or slaveholder class who has seized all the lands and held all the means of creating wealth began to discover that the easiest mode of managing their slaves and making them profitable was not for each slaveholder to hold his specific number of slaves as he had done before, and as he would hold on, as he would hold so many cattle, but to give them so much liberty as would throw upon themselves, the slaves, the responsibility of their own subsistence, and yet compelled them to sell their labor to the land-holding class. Their former owners were just what the latter might choose to give them. So we're always told about Rome as being such a great place, the Roman Empire. By the time that almost the collapse took place in Rome, they basically, the wealthy owned approximately 96 to 97% of the land. What they did was simply there's such a thing as what we talk about in the Bible. It's called Jubilee, and I think it occurs every 50 years. And it was a practice, is what I understand, just what the Bible is saying simply is that your debts were forgiven. Your debts were forgiven, and everything went blank. It's like a new deal. And what happened was simply is, as a farmer, as being a farmer in itself is a risk, because you have to have good soil. Hopefully you have good seeds, but you have to have the weather to cooperate with you. So you need rain when things are starting to get dry. You need rain. You don't need a flood, but you need rains that actually, a steady rain that actually goes through the soil and benefits the crops. If you don't get those things, and you have actually what we call not bartered, but what you've done is simply ask for credit to buy other things in order when you get your harvest, you would actually repay a merchant or someone else in that way to get things settled. And then you would actually plan and not settle, but keep what you had for the winter and save the seeds again to start spring. Being a farmer, I'm talking about a small farmer. I'm not talking about these farmers out here that plow thousands of acres. There's no risk for them, you see. All that changed, and that's another thing we need to talk about sometime. In the 1980s, it was a way of the larger corporations were able to steal here in America when the banks would no longer give the loans to the farmers. And they lost everything. Of course, these liberated slaves, as some have erroneously called them, having no lands or other property and no means of attaining an independent subsistence, and no alternate to save themselves from starvation, but to sell their labor to the landholders in exchange only for their courses necessary of life, not always for so much, even at that. Yeah, and what's really saddens me is simply is greed. It's greed. It's wanting to have more in order to actually take from others. There's plenty of land on this planet, or this realm, whatever you want to call it, for everybody to have 40 acres and actually be what I would call probably the choicest soil, the choicest land. But that's not true. History has proven it always is that the well-off always take advantage of the misfortune of others. That's why Scripture kind of speaks about something. The last will become first, and the first will be last. Sounds like some type of judgment. I can't expound on that, but I would say simply is it sounds like that in a basic way. But it's also simply is that we have it somewhat easy at this point in our lives. Or I know in my life, far easier because I have a garden, yes, but I'm not totally dependent upon it. You see. Now that may change in the future. Okay. So let's continue here. These liberated slaves, as they were called, were now scarcely less slaves than they were before. Their means of subsistence were perhaps even more precarious than when each had his own owner who had an interest to preserve his life. They were liable at the caprice of interests of the landholders to be thrown out of homes, employment, and the opportunity of even earning a subsistence by their labor. They were therefore in large numbers driven to the necessary of begging, stealing, or starving, and became, of course, dangerous to the property and quite of their late masters. I understand that. Quite okay. The consequence was that these late owners found it necessary for their own safety and the safety of their property to organize themselves more perfectly as a government and make laws for keeping these dangerous people in subjection. That is, laws fixing the prices at which they should be compelled to labor, and also prescribing fearful punishment, even death itself, for such thefts and trespasses as they were driven to commit as their own means of saving themselves from starvation. You know, this is really sad because during the Depression, there were many people suffering here in this country in many ways. And I told the story for not many times, but quite a few times, about my grandparents on my mom's side, that people would come to their house and say, we'll work for food. No, they didn't say work for money. They said they work for food. So that was in the 1920s and the 30s. I don't know if that would actually extend today, it seems, because it seems the more people get, they become more and more greedy. Seems to be a problem with the more people get, so to speak, they don't feel for their fellow man. The consequences was that these late owners, these laws have continued in force for hundreds and in some countries for thousands of years, and are in force today. And in greater or less severity in nearly all the countries on the globe. The purpose and effect of these laws have been to maintain in the hands of the robber or slaveholder class a monopoly of all lands as far as possible of all other means of creating wealth, and thus to keep the great body of laborers in such a state of poverty and dependence as would compel them to sell their labor to their tyrants for the lowest price at which life could be sustained. The result of all this is that the little wealth there is in the world in the hands of a few, that is, in the hands of the law-making slave-holding classes, who are now as much slaveholders in spirit as they were ever, but who accomplished their purposes by means of the law they made for keeping the laborers in subjection and dependence, instead of each one owning his individual slaves as so many chattels. Thus, the whole business of legislation, which has now grown to such gigantic proportion. Now, this is him in 1882. Well, this is actually before 1882, because it's actually it's before 1882. Well, maybe no, I take that back. I think I have to look when he passed away. Well, he passed away in 1887, so 5 years before that. So the whole business of legislation, which has now grown to such gigantic proportions, had its origin in the conspiracies which have always existed among the few, for the purpose of holding the many in subjection, and extorting from them their labor and all the profits of their labor. And the real motives and spirit which lie at the foundation of all legislation, notwithstanding all the pretenses and disguises by which they attempt to hide themselves, are the same today as they always have been. The whole purpose of this legislation is simply to keep one class of men in subordination and servitude to another. Section 4. What then is legislation? It is the assumption by one man or body of men of absolute irresponsible dominion over all other men whom they can subject to their power. It is the assumption by one man or body of men, or a right to subject all other men to their will and their service. It is the assumption by one man or body of men of a right to abolish outright all the natural rights, all the natural liberty of all other men, to make all other men their slaves, to arbitrarily dictate to all other men what they may or may not do, what they may and may not have, what they may and may not be. It is, in short, the assumption of a right to banish the principle of human rights, the principle of justice itself, from all from off the earth and set up their own personal will, pleasure, and interest in its place. All this nothing less is involved in the very idea that there can be any such thing as human legislation that is obligatory upon those upon whom it is imposed. Sir William Jones, an English judge in India and one of the most learned judges that ever lived, learned in Ascitia as well as European law, said is is pleasing to remark the similarity, or rather the identical, of those conclusions which pure, unbiased reason in all ages and nations seldom fails to draw in such judicial inquiries as are not fettered and managed by positive institution. This is Jones on Bailments 133. He means here to say that when no law has been made in violation of justice, judicial tribunals in all ages and nations have seldom failed to agree as to what justice is. So that's the end of the book here. So it's really not that long of a read, and it's worthy that someone would actually own these copy because it's not that much money. And he did also Lysander Spoon also did a book called The Constitution That Never. No, I'm thinking about Ralph Borensky. I'm sorry. Anyway, I wanted just to share this with you today. I want to complete that because I felt this needs to be shared to the public. So there's an opportunity for you in the future to understand what natural law is. Some use what we call God's law, but I've always liked the word natural law. Just has a good ring to it. Okay, if you have any questions, please put them here and share with others. You're welcome also to share my videos to others. This needs to be shared with others, folks. It's just not just for you to read and look at. It's also important for you to share to others. This is important that we share these things so that we can educate one another and teach one another to see what really is going on and have discernment in realizing that our fellow man is in reality needs to understand how things haven't flipped, but have flipped here in this country tremendously here in America. So I see a gentleman here, JC. Yes, hello. How are you doing? Good to see you here, JC. So my thinking here is when I share these videos on YouTube and also on Facebook, you can share these to other people so that you can enlighten others, not only yourselves, but others. This is critical for us to see and to understand. And so I'm doing this because simply as I have a passion for truth, and I have the desire for all men to be at peace with one another, no matter the color, no matter religion or whatever, which is what those in power use, try to, what's the word, keep us divided. They divide us on many issues. Please don't fall for that trick. That trick is an old trick, and it's been used forever, and that's why they're still in power. Do not allow these things that just issues. Just realize simply is that each person here is at a different level of their evolution of their spirit or soul. Not everyone here is at a certain level, and we must be patient to teach others. So, yes, you're from Australia, JC. So, where are you from in Australia? Are you out in you're in the Perth area in Western Australia? And I'm just curious. I had a friend who visited me years ago who was from Australia, and she was from Geraldton, Australia, which is actually on the western coast. That area is pretty much. The thing I've understood about Australia, JC, is that everybody lives on the coast. Not many people, quote unquote, live not many. What I would say, there's not much. Almost the interior of all the land. I wondered at one time maybe it was actually beneficial land, and it changed dramatically. Just like if we look at what we call Northern Africa, at one time it was an oasis, and then the weather changed and drastically it became a desert. Even though there's plenty of water underneath that, most people are unaware of the desert areas. You just got to know where to look. So let's see. So you're up north from Perth. Okay, well, that's Perth, Western Australia. It's a prison colony. Yeah, well, everywhere is a prison colony, JC. If you want to really be straightforward about it, it's just as simply as some are actually, how would I say it, that some are in the barn, and then some actually have a fence. So some of the barn are actually restricted far more, and those actually in the has a fence around that have a little bit more freedom, so to speak. So let's see what it says here. If you have heard of him, I've never heard of WAI. I don't know what that's about. Oh, Romley Stewart. No, I have not heard of him. You might want to look into a guy I have followed for quite a while, who's lives on the land, tries to live on the land. He's called Author Christian. That's spelled Christian. He's done some incredible videos, and he is someone who has actually believes that he actually was a demonstration of that in his home at one time, of how to grow food and have plenty of food within his lot. And it was a very small area where he lived at. He had a house, such and actually, and he had children and a wife, and they were able to eat what they did. But it wasn't based upon this American idea. It was based upon having trees and all the soil tilted in a way, and the trees, there were trees there, and there were what I would call what's the word I want to call it? It was in the shade. These particular crops they grew, vegetables, were in the shade. They were not out in the sun, and they produced fruit and they produced vegetables. In fact, more than they could eat themselves. So look up him. He's on YouTube. His name is Author, Arthur, I think, and Christian, Christian. So see, you said check him out, mate. He is the man that knows the full system. The Justian deception, all roads lead to Rome. Cool. What was his name again? Yeah, it's Author Christian, Christian. He's basically himself tried to pull himself out of the system also. So he's trying to live in the world, but not of the world, so to speak. I've listened to him quite a few times, and I've been impressed with him. He's got a lot of knowledge. I may not agree with everything he says, but that doesn't mean he's bad. He's a good man. Well, I'm gonna have to go, JC. I guess it's there. It's about 4 o'clock here, so it's probably either, I'm guessing if you're in Western, you must be about 6 o'clock your time in the morning. I'm guessing that, or 7 o'clock in the morning. Okay. Thank you, JC. You have a great not even, you actually have a great day, because I think the day is starting. So I think that's what I understand. There's like 18 hours difference, depending on what part of Australia you're in. How about that? Okay. Thank you, JC, for the compliments here. You take care. You're always welcome to share. Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.